to introduce Professor John Lennox, who's a Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, as well as an Emeritus Fellow in Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College in Oxford. And now, John Lennox's field is group theory. So I went to the library and got some books on group theory, but unfortunately this is not quite my field, so I don't have a full understanding of this, but I'm sure that this is not the topic of your lecture also. Now, I see John Lennox as standing in the great tradition of British scientists, and I would like to mention four of them, because the four greatest physicists in Britain the last half of the 19th century were William Thomson, or the Lord Kelvin, who's known for thermodynamics. It was George Gabriel Stokes, who's known for fluid dynamics. And it's Baron Rayleigh, who is known for acoustics, as well as a Nobel Prize in discovering argon. Acoustics, by the way, is my field. Now, all of these three were very clear on the importance of the Christian faith for their life and for the science. And it is clear from their writings that they were inspired by it. And the last one of the four is probably the most famous one, which is sometimes called the greatest physicist between Newton and Einstein, and that was James Maxwell. Now, I went to Cambridge, to the Cavendish lab that he led for some years, and from which 29 Nobel Prizes have come. And over the entrance, he had carved the works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein, from Psalm 111 in the Bible. The last of these four died in 1919. That was Baron Rayleigh. So that's 99 years ago, and certainly they believed in God in a scientific world. Now, we want an update 99 years later. Is it still relevant? So now I'll leave the word to you.
I'm sure you'll be interested to know that one of my textbooks is called Subnormal Subgroups of Groups. It is usually classified under abnormal psychology. It's a great honor to be in the university of two famous group theorists, Niels Henrik Abel and Sophus Lee. And I've often thought particularly of the first one in his genius, who is reputed to have kept mathematicians alive for about 300 years after his brilliant work on equations of the fifth degree. So it is an honor to be in the University of Oslo, and I am asked to speak to you on can we believe in God in a scientific world. I'm not quite sure what a scientific world is, but we shall investigate that as we go. I think the first point to make is misconceptions. First of all, Alvin Plantinga, one of the world's most distinguished philosophers, says, the alleged conflict between science and theism is superficial. There is real concord. And secondly, the alleged concord between science and atheism is superficial. There is real conflict. So we ought to balance our talk with another talk with this title: Can we believe in atheism in a scientific world? And I shall be reflecting on that as we go along. Now, Professor Holm has mentioned some of the pioneers of science, 16th, 17th centuries and later, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, but I thought I ought to put a mathematician in among them, and that is Euler. All of them firm believers in God. And the first question to ask from a historical perspective, does that help us in any way to see a connection between faith in God as creator and the rise of modern science? And indeed it does. Professor Alfred North Whitehead, quoted by Lewis here, points out that centuries of belief in a God who combined the personal energy of Jehovah with the rationality of a Greek philosopher first produced that firm expectation of systematic order which rendered possible the birth of modern science. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. The alleged conflict between science and theism is superficial. The second thing to notice is that the alleged conflict is the wrong conflict. I want to argue with you that there's a real conflict, but it's not between science and God. It is between two worldviews, naturalism on the one side, which is atheistic, and theism on the other side. And it's easy to see that the conflict is not between science and God. There are two Nobel Prize winners for physics, Stephen Weinberg and Charles Townes. They've both achieved the pinnacle of work in physics, so their physics doesn't distinguish them. What does distinguish them? Their worldview. Weinberg is a notable atheist, and Charles Townes was a Christian. And you may not be aware, I hope the statistic is reasonably right, that in the century from 1900 to 2000, over 60% of Nobel Prize winners actually believed in God. So what we need to investigate is just exactly what the relationship is between worldviews and the scientists that hold them. Because you see, it's not so much believing in God in a scientific world, it's every one of us in this room has a worldview that we bring to the study of any field whatsoever. Some people are very open about that. For example, George Klein, who won the Nobel Prize, says, "I'm not an agnostic. I'm an atheist. My attitude is not based on science, but rather on faith." Notice how he contrasts science with faith. We'll come to that in a minute. "The absence of a creator, the non-existence of God is my childhood faith, my adult belief unshakable and holy." So he starts with his worldview, which is atheistic. He then brings that to bear on his science. Here's someone who did the exact opposite. You've probably never heard of him, but I need to tell you about him because he's the only Irish Nobel Prize winner for physics, and I happen to be Irish. So for that reason, this is E.T.S. Walton, who worked on splitting the atom, so he's a very famous person. One way, he said, to learn the mind of the Creator is to study his creation. We must pay God the compliment of studying his work of art, and this should apply to all realms of human thought. A refusal to use our intelligence honestly is an act of contempt for him who gave us that intelligence. So two diametrically opposed worldviews, but the same level of qualification in physics. So we must never think that the conflict is between science and God. It simply is not. That's enough to show it. It lies between worldviews. So if we think of these three major things, there's naturalism, physicalism, and materialism on the one side and theism on the other side. How do they relate to science? Richard Dawkins wants to say that science leads to atheism. I want to say the exact opposite, so we disagree. Now, there's a third major family of worldviews, which I'm not considering here pantheism. But generally speaking, most of us fit into one of the three major worldview families. But if the conflict is superficial, why is it so widespread? What fuels it? Well, the first thing that fuels it is that statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. And Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, said, "I believe that a scientist looking at non-scientific problems is just as dumb as the next guy." And it's easy to forget that because science is such authority in our culture that when a scientist speaks, when Stephen Hawking says there's no God, people accept it because of his correct authority in science. But that's simply an assertion by him on his own authority. It's his own belief. It's his own worldview. There are several other things that confuse the issue, and I'm going to look at some of them briefly. First of all, there's a confusion about faith. Secondly, the failure to recognize that science has its limits, as in our title, A Scientific World. Thirdly, confusion about the nature of explanation, scientific or otherwise. So let's look at faith. What is faith? Well, for many people influenced by the current wave of atheism, faith is a religious word, and it means believing where there's no evidence. So Lennox here is a man of faith, which is about the biggest insult that you could give him, because it means he believes where there's no evidence, so it is not worth talking to him. But this is not faith. Faith in English and in many other languages derives from the Latin fides, from which we get the English fidelity, trust, reliability, and so on. And it is an attitude that we use every day. You didn't check every result in the scientific textbook you used. You trusted the results because your professor was reliable or because you felt that the textbook author was reliable. In every area of life, we exercise faith. You're exercising faith this moment in the chair you're sitting on. You're hoping it won't collapse. You trust it. So that this idea that faith is believing where there's no evidence is dangerously wrong. That's only blind faith, ordinary faith, the trust I put in my wife, the trust you put in your friends, the trust you put in your bank, or perhaps more importantly, the trust your bank puts in you. Those are all matters of the ordinary use of the word faith, and it is always connected with evidence. You can always ask, if somebody says, I trust that, you say, for what reason? What is your evidence? Now, the Christian faith, which is my position, is not blind faith. And this is very important that we realize that. One of the fourth gospel, where John says Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe. Here's the evidence that you might believe. In other words, Christianity is an evidence-based faith, but it's not only evidence for faith in a set of propositions, it's evidence for faith in a person, so you require much more. So then, faith is not just a religious word, it's a scientific word. Really? Yes, let's come to Einstein, the great master. Because Einstein talked about what is the basic attitude for doing science. Listen to this. Science can only be created by those who are thoroughly imbued with the aspiration towards truth and understanding. The source of feeling springs from the sphere of religion. To this there also belongs the faith. Please notice that. In the possibility that the regulations valid for the world of existence are rational, that is comprehensible to reason. I cannot conceive of a genuine scientist without that profound faith. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, scientists are people of faith, all of them without exception, for a very obvious reason. You cannot do science without believing it can be done. You cannot do science without believing there is order to be found in the universe, that you can argue to other people so that there's some degree of objectivity. Science depends on faith. So here's the other false idea that people have grasped, that religion involves faith and therefore is useless. Science doesn't involve faith. Both are totally wrong. So we need to correct some of these false ideas. But you see, can you believe in God in a scientific world? Now, that made me think of a very common view. Dawkins believes it, Hawking believed it, and that is scientism. that science is the only way to truth. Now, our title could be interpreted that way, a scientific world. What would you mean by a scientific world? I can understand a scientific fact, but a scientific world? What does that mean? That the only way of gaining truth about the world is through science. Bertrand Russell once famously wrote, "Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know." Now, Russell was a brilliant logician, but not here. Just think of the statement, "Whatever science cannot discover, mankind cannot know." Is that a statement of science? No, it isn't. Therefore, if it's true, it's false. It's too late in the afternoon for logic, I'm afraid. But anyway, this is a wild extreme of scientism, the only way to truth. Another Nobel Prize winner, Erwin Schrödinger, again a physicist, he got it right. Look what he says about science. The scientific picture is very deficient. It gives us loads of factual information, but it's ghastly silent about everything near to our heart. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain, physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. It sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we're not inclined to take them seriously. That's a right attitude to science, but let's have it more precise because it's important. Here's another Nobel Prize winner from Oxford, Sir Peter Medawar. And what he's saying is vastly important. Science is not coextensive with rationality. Otherwise, half the departments and faculties in this famous university would have to shut tomorrow. There'd be no history, there'd be no economics, there would be no languages, there would be no literature, music, art, or anything else because they're not natural sciences. And Medawar pointed out that there is indeed a limit upon science as made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. These are the questions that children ask, the ultimate questions of Karl Popper. Such questions as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? It's not to science, he adds, therefore, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. Science has been successful. Why? Because it asks a limited range of questions. It doesn't deal with every aspect of reality. Now, when Stephen Hawking co-authored his book, The Grand Design, he mentioned some of these questions by Popper. And he said, traditionally, these are questions for philosophy. But, said Hawking, philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Now, that's scientism, more or less, again. But please notice what he says. Philosophy is dead. Now, the Cambridge Department of Philosophy were not very pleased about that statement. And some of them, ironically, like I did, were very surprised that Hawking said that because it comes at the beginning of a book about what topic? The philosophy of science. So to say it's dead before you start is not a very hopeful way of progressing. Now let me say something. Stephen Hawking was a genius. I remember him at Cambridge just when his motor neurone disease had started. Mathematically, he's light years better than I am. So let not what I say be taken as criticism for his mathematics. What I'm going to say is more in line with Einstein, who once said, the mathematician is a poor philosopher. And at the farewell or the burial service for Hawking, Lord Rees, who's our astronomer royal, said, I know Stephen very well. I know he doesn't know any theology and even less philosophy. And we shouldn't take him seriously on any of these topics. And I thought that was a very honest statement of a man who praised Hawking. And personally, I wish he'd won the Nobel Prize because someone had discovered Hawking radiation. but that remains to be done. So I'm not criticizing this mathematician, but what concerns me is, with this great authority, he comes across to say that philosophy is dead, that science is bearing the torch of truth, and is going to solve these ultimate questions. And I think he's achieved none of them. And I want to suggest that to you just very briefly. Now, Hawking's also interesting because he occupied, up until not so long ago, Isaac Newton's chair at Cambridge. So you've Isaac Newton and you've Stephen Hawking. They both worked on gravity. Isaac Newton discovered gravity, and he believed in God. Stephen Hawking worked on gravitational black holes, and he didn't believe in God. So here are two people involved in working on gravity, one an atheist and one a theist. And I asked myself when I read the book, how do you get really from Newton to Hawking? What has happened? Is something about science that has changed, or something about theology, or what is it? So I decided to write a book about it. And here are some of the ideas that I came up with. There are three reasons, I believe, why some of these eminent scientists are atheists. First of all, there's a logical problem. Secondly, there are problems with their ideas about God. And thirdly, there are problems about their ideas about explanation. Now, the first one of the central statements of this book, is where Hawking is talking about the positive energy and the negative gravitational energy in the universe being balanced. And then he says, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And I thought, I would like to think about that. He then said that M theory, you needn't worry about what that is the only candidate for a complete theory of the universe. Now, the first point I want to make is that this has been heavily criticized. He says it's the only candidate. His co-worker, Sir Roger Penrose, says his book is misleading. It gives you this impression of a theory that's going to explain everything. It's nothing of the sort. It's not even a theory. And I actually knew of one of the co-workers of Stephen Hawking who's a Christian. So I wrote to him, does this M theory, how does it affect faith in God or not? Here's what he wrote back. Even if M theory were a fully formulated theory, which it isn't yet, and were correct, which of course we don't know, that would not imply that God did not create the universe. So here's someone who goes down the same lines as Hawking, but interprets theologically the results in the complete opposite direction. Now, that was the first thing that interested me. But then coming back to this famous statement, I was interested in a universe that can create itself from nothing. You say, well, it's interesting, isn't it? If I say to you, X creates Y, well, roughly speaking, if you've got X, you'll get Y somehow. If I say X creates X, what does that mean? If you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it seems to me to mean that nonsense remains nonsense even if scientists write it. And you see, because there's a law like gravity, but that's the existence of something. It's not the existence of nothing. And then it puzzles me with that big sentence. Is he talking about nothing in terms of zero? That is, because there's a law like gravity, the positive and negative energies balance to zero. But that doesn't mean nothing, as you very well know. If your assets exactly balance your debts, it doesn't mean there's nothing in existence. It simply means you're financially zero. Okay? So it seems to me there are possibilities of serious confusion there. But I then started to study nothing. And I've been giving lectures on nothing all around the world. I'm not going to weary you with a lecture of nothing, but I came across this gem. I just love this. This is by one of the world's best-known astrophysicists, Lawrence Krauss. How about this? Just analyze it logically, folks. Surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. What? That is sheer nonsense, of course. And that concerns me. Now, why is there a problem here? The problem is created by contemporary cosmology and the Standard Model. Because the universe is reduced backwards in time to nothing. Now this, I never thought I'd live to see, where the choices are God or nothing. But that's where we've got to. So that if you are someone like Hawking and Krauss, you've got to get a universe from nothing. So what do? Redefine nothing. Now, I was puzzled by this until I suddenly was invited and terrified at the prospect of doing a debate with Alan Guth, the father of the cosmological theory of inflation, at the Harvard MIT Faculty Club a couple of years ago, packed with professors. And Alan Guth turned out to be a very friendly man and talked about his theory of inflation. And I asked the first question, which I rarely do. I said, Alan, I can't resist this. I said, out there in the public, there's much ado about nothing. The people are bothered. They don't know what nothing is. Tell me, as a cosmologist, when you use the word nothing, do you mean what most of us mean? The absence of anything? He said, no, we do not. I said, thank you very much. They haven't got a universe from nothing. Hawking in his book says there's no such thing as empty space. He talks about a quantum vacuum with particles coming in and out of existence. Now, all of that is fascinating stuff to think about. But what bothers me is the claim is we've solved the biggest question of life. We can get a universe without God. In fact, we can get it from nothing. They have done no such thing. So on we go. Of course, the next thing is to ask about the origin of the laws, because there is a law of gravity. Now, that raises fascinating questions for me. What would a law of gravity mean if there's no universe to describe it? And where do the laws come from anyway? Do they come fitted to the universe as descriptors of what normally happens as we regard them? Now, most interestingly, Hawking says that the answer of Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, and Clerk Maxwell was the laws were the work of God. However, this is no more than a definition of God as an embodiment of the laws of nature. It isn't actually. And he realizes it, unless, he says, one endows God with some other attributes, such as being the God of the Old Testament. Employing God as a response merely substitutes one mystery for another. So if we involve God, the real crunch comes with the question, are there miracles, exceptions to the laws? Now, I might not get to that question, so you might want to ask it at the end. But you see, unless you endow God with more properties, well, why not? Because from where I sit, the most intelligent thing now to do is to endow God with the properties that are ascribed to him by the biblical worldview. And here you see, we're told that the universe is not made from anything physical, but it's not made from nothing. It is created by God, because God has been forever in existence. And that, in one sense, puts a different perspective entirely on this big question. The second thing is that the universe is created and upheld by God, who's not material, but is spirit. And so here's a stark choice, God or nothing. And one of my colleagues at Oxford, Professor Keith Ward, says, if biblical theism is true, not only is matter not the only reality, matter is not even the prime reality. There's at least one mind that is prior to all matter, that is not in time, and is not capable of being brought into being by anything. It is the one truly self-existent reality and the cause of all physical things. Now, this is not, and I don't pretend it to be, an exhaustive treatment. I simply want to stimulate you to think, and to think about nothing, if you would. to see whether you feel these people have solved the problem, because there are more issues to come. The next issue are false ideas about God. Now, this struck me relatively recently. I could not understand why many leading thinkers would say you must choose between God and science. I couldn't understand that. I could never understand that until I realized they were talking about a different God from me. Because their concept of God, and you'll see Hawking with it in his book, is a kind of Greek God, let's say, of lightning. The ancients couldn't understand lightning, they were afraid of it, so they postulated a God behind it. But if you go to Atmospheric Physics 101 in this university, the God of lightning will disappear. Because it's only a God of the gaps. It's a placeholder until science advances to fill the space of explanation. Now, follow me carefully. If you define God, as many people do these days, to be the explanation for what science has not yet explained, of course you have to choose between God and science, because that's the way you've defined God. You've defined God to be that which science has not yet explained. So you've got to choose between the two. And that was an aha moment for me. I realized that we're talking about different things. Because when I talk about God, I'm talking about not the God of the gaps, but the God of the whole show. You may have noticed that the Bible does not begin with the words, "In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand." Well, that's just foolish, but that's the way it sounds. It's very important to realize, you see, that this kind of thinking was behind Newton. He didn't give up belief in God because he discovered the law of gravity. He didn't say, I've got a scientific explanation, I don't need God. No. What did he say? Well, he wrote the Principia Mathematica, the most famous mathematics book in history, hoping that it would persuade thinking people to believe in a deity. In other words, he was saying, isn't this mathematics wonderful? What a brilliant God who did it that way. So his increase in knowledge of how it worked increased his worship of God, not diminished it. And I have found the same in my own little life. And one of the things that he didn't observe so well because he didn't have the information is what Hawking says in his book. Please notice Hawking calls his book The Grand Design. Why does he do that? Because he sees a grand design. And what he says about it is, as you see, our universe and its laws appear to have a design that's tailor-made to support us, and if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. That is not easily explained. The discovery of the extreme fine-tuning of so many of the laws of nature could lead us, at least some of us, back to the old idea that this grand design is the work of some grand designer. That is not the answer of modern science. Our universe seems to be one of many, each with different laws. Now, please notice the nature of these arguments. The old idea. C.S. Lewis had a marvelous word for that argument. He called it chronological snobbery. Because it's old, it's wrong. Well, since I'm old, obviously, I must be wrong. Ideas that are old aren't necessarily wrong. That's just nonsensical. Secondly, he says that that is not the answer of modern science. That's an incorrect statement. That is not the answer of some modern scientists. It is the answer of some modern scientists. So he's conflating science with a group of scientists. And then he says, the alternative to God is the multiverse. But any philosopher will tell you, God and the multiverse are not alternatives. Indeed, God could create as many universes as he likes. The ideas are not antipathetic. So fine-tuning comes again as one of these important ideas. I had a debate not so long ago with one of our senior professors of philosophy. And he said, I want you to meet my students, and they're going to give you a very rough time, 100 philosophers. And I said, well, that's okay. And he said, I hope you'll use my best argument against atheism. Oh, I said, please help me. He's an atheist, of course, a very famous one. I said, what's your best argument against atheism? Oh, he said, obviously. He said, if I were ever to become a Christian or a theist, it would be fine-tuning. I think there's a lot of weight behind it. Okay, I said, I'll use it. And I did. So the fine-tuning, which is a hugely interesting field, is one of those indicators to my mind of the specialness of our universe. The accuracy to which the basic constants of nature have to be tuned to have a universe like this. It's a bit of evidence. It's not a mathematical proof, of course. But you never will get mathematical proofs of God or anything else except in pure mathematics. Because rigorous proof only occurs in pure mathematics. In every other field, it's giving evidence, giving arguments to the best explanation, etc. But there is no such thing as rigorous logical proof. But then let's come down to questions of explanation. I learned the law of gravity at school, and I was told that gravity explained. I wish I'd asked my teacher, sir, what does gravity explain? Because you know what I used to think? I used to think the law of gravity explained gravity. But it doesn't. Newton said it in Latin, so I didn't grasp it the first time I read it. Non fingo hypothesi. I'm not making hypotheses. I don't know what this stuff is. My law relates the motions of heavy bodies in relationship to one another, and the law of gravity describes those motions, but it doesn't tell you what gravity is. A little bit more research showed me nobody today really knows what gravity is, nor do they know what energy is, nor do they know what time is. So we need to be humble here. It doesn't explain. Now here's the big problem. Somebody's dealing with science and God and says, but science explains. Watch that very carefully, because very frequently the scientific explanation is very partial. Let me give you a simple illustration. Why is the water boiling? Well, you say it's boiling because there's the heat from a gas flame is being conducted through the copper kettle base, agitating the molecules. That's why the water's boiling. Well, of course, but it's boiling because I would just love a cup of coffee. A little ripple of laughter. But you see the point. Those are two explanations for the same thing. Tell me, do they conflict? No. Do they compete? No. They complement. Now, this is such a simple example. There's a scientific law-like explanation involving heat. There's a personal agency explanation. Why can that not be true of the universe? Science studies how it works. God's the answer to who made it. They don't compete. And the way I often put it to people is this: Newton's law of gravitation no more competes with God as an explanation of the universe than the law of internal combustion competes with Henry Ford as an explanation of the motor car. One more thing about explanation. Does explanation, as we're sometimes told, always go from the simple to the complex? Well, Dawkins seems to think it does. You can't use a designer God to explain organized complexity, because any God capable of designing anything would have to be complex enough to demand the same kind of explanation in his own right. Well, let's apply that to Dawkins' own book, The God Delusion. It's quite complex. So I was interested in where it came from, and somebody suggested to me that it came from the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. So I dismissed that. You can't explain it, Richard Dawkins, book by Richard Dawkins, because then you would have to explain Richard Dawkins. You see, there's something gone wrong with the logic. And what's gone wrong with the logic is very simple. Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you see anything with language involved, like that up there, one of those words, you know a mind's been involved. Whatever the physical processes, whatever the materials, you know a mind has been involved because you see that those marks are semiotic. They carry meaning. And whenever you see that, you postulate mind. I think that's an extremely important intuition. And just to illustrate it, finally, I want to go back to our faith as scientists. Because sometimes I have fun with my colleagues and I ask them, what do you do science with? And they tell me about some billion-dollar machine. I said, I don't mean that. Oh, you mean our... And they're about to say brain when they realize that it's not politically correct to say brain. Mind, sorry. You mean our brain. I said, okay, you believe the brain is the mind. I don't, but let's stick with the brain. Tell me the brief history of the brain. Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I smile at them and I say, and you trust it. Tell me, if you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I always wait for an answer. And in many years, I've never got the answer. Yes, I would. So why do you trust your mind? And often they say to me, you know, that's a very interesting question. Where did you get it? I said, you'll not believe. I'm not clever enough to think of a question like that. But actually, Darwin thought of it. What? Yes, he did. But then with me, he wrote, the horrid doubt always arises, whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? Now, that is now moved to the center of the philosophical debate, because now it's not just Christians that are bringing it up, but atheists. One of the most famous is Thomas Nagel. Look at the title of his book. I thought, can anybody dare to write a book like that in the 21st century? Why the neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false. Nagel's one of the world's top philosophers. And what he's getting at is this central Darwinian argument. If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. But he didn't get there first. C.S. Lewis got there years ago. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. The naturalists have been engaged in thinking about nature. They have not attended to the fact that they were thinking. The moment one attends to this, it's obvious that one's own thinking cannot be merely a natural event, and therefore something other than nature exists. So here's something very important to my mind. Can I believe in atheism in a scientific age? With huge difficulty? Because as far as I can see, atheism removes the grounds for doing any science at all. That's a pretty provocative statement, but it's only fair to balance up what we said at the beginning. So in coming to a conclusion, we have lived to see that we have got biological molecules that carry information. What does that point to? Well, the obvious intuition, it points to a word-based universe. The moment we see a thing like that, we postulate mind everywhere else except here, because we've got to find an explanation that fits with atheism, and that one does not do that. So we haven't time to go into the fascinating thing that the very brief description of creation in the first book in the Bible is profound beyond belief, because it says this universe was built up in a series of energetic and informational inputs from outside a non-closed system. And God said, or to update that into New Testament times, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. All things were made by him. Made by nothing, made by word. And every intuition, for me as a mathematician, in the mathematical describability of the universe, in the fine-tuning of the universe, in the information contained in our biology, points in one direction, and that is the grand design is grand, because there is a grand designer. And I love these words by astronomer Arno Penzias, who won the Nobel Prize. Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe made out of nothing with the precise fine-tuning which is necessary for life and which one might say has an underlying supernatural plan. Well, now, that brings us to Hawking's second point, that the whole business of a universe with laws raises the question as to the status of those laws. The central claim of Christianity is, and the Word, that is God, became human and dwelt among us. Are miracles a step too far in a scientific age? According to Hawking, if we involve God, then the real crunch comes with miracles. And he says his book is rooted in the concept of scientific determinism, which implies the answer is that there are no miracles, nor exceptions to the laws. Are miracles a step too far? Well, if you want to know, you'll have to ask me, because I'm done. The time's up. Thank you very much. I should just say to those of you who feel that's unfair, I gave a lecture in Harvard on miracles, and it's online under veritas.org. I've also written about miracles and David Hume in my book, Gunning for God. So at least I'm not running away from the question, but over to you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Professor Lennox. I should say that there are some books on sales at the back of the hall here, and you might even ask him for some signatures of them. 2 of his books have recently been translated into Norwegian. You are open for some questions and some answers, and you want the questions in a particular way.
Yes, I would. In an audience like this, everybody likes to hear the other people's questions. So I collect a few before I comment on any. So keep your questions short, brief. I'll write it down, and then when we've got a few, I'll try and comment on them. Okay? Off you go. There's one down there.
Yes, so we are bringing the microphone so everybody can hear.
Thank you for a very great lecture. I saw you had the slide by Dennis Noble. So I was just a bit curious about, since he's a very famous guy in this movement of the paradigm shift in biology, and he has published a lot of works about agency in biology. And I was just interested in how you can relate his work with reductionism and how agency shows that naturalism is wrong.
Thank you very much. Next. I meant what I said, you see.
Concerning both students and faculty, do you find that they're more or less receptive to theistic ideas than they were, say, 15 or 20 years ago?
Okay, thank you. Next. 3.
My question is very short. I just wanted to know that since you used the argument that you cannot trust your mind, so how can you trust your mind to do scientific things? How can
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh yeah, I just since you used the argument that how can you trust your mind to do scientific things, I was just wondering how can you trust your mind to believe in God if it's
Okay. Right, number 4.
I have a question. Thank you for that exceptional lecture. I'm wondering about something. Is there time, matter, and space, did they came to existence simultaneously with the laws of science in them?
Sorry, what's the question?
The question is if time, space, and matter come to existence, was created simultaneously.
Okay. Next.
Well, what are your thoughts on well, the great religious questions, really, what this means for us and whether we have souls, and about the afterlife, and your input on that?
Okay. I'll take 7. We got to 5. Here's one here.
Do you think it's metaphysically possible that there is no God?
Now, wait a minute. Just go a bit slower.
Do you think it is metaphysically possible that there is no God?
Okay, 7.
Do you believe, Mr. Lennox, that necessarily God exists, or do you think that there might be a possibility that God does in fact not exist? And if so, then why believe in God? When one could simply remain in doubt of the God question. Do we really need a belief in God?
Okay, that's about 4 questions, but never mind. Okay. I've reached the end of the page. Let me have a go at some of these. Dennis Noble is a very interesting man in Oxford. I know him fairly well, and I'm a strange mathematician. I go to a lot of biology seminars, and I've been very interested in listening to his critiques of the neo-Darwinian synthesis and in his anti-reductionism. You see, a great deal of what lies behind Dawkins and Hawking and so on is the idea that everything can be explained bottom up, or everything can be reduced to simple elements. I want to argue that that is impossible, and I want to bring physics in, because physics has at last presented us with the concept of information as apparently irreducible to physics and chemistry. Now, that's a hugely interesting thing, because it means that physical materialism is false, because information is not material. But Dennis Noble is, as you say, a systems biologist. He really invented the subject. And he is very clear on this, that if we reduce rational behavior simply to molecular and cellular causation, which you have to do if there's no top-down causation, then, he says, we would no longer be able meaningfully to express the truth of what we had succeeded in doing. In any case, the question does not arise, no such reduction is conceivable. Now, it takes a lot of courage to say that in a reductionist scientific community. My teacher of quantum mechanics at Cambridge, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, makes a similar point. He said the reductionists reduce thought to the firing of synapses in the brain, and therefore they empty it of all meaning. So that reductionism is not the way to go to remain intelligible. And that relates to one of these questions about trusting my mind. How do you trust your mind to believe in God? But just half a minute. What I am claiming is not that atheists don't trust their minds. Of course they do. Not that they don't do as brilliant science as Christians. Of course they do, and much better. And why is that possible? Because from where I sit, everyone, whatever they believe, is made in the image of God and can show his creative reflection. I'm making a very careful point. I'm saying that many of my atheist colleagues have no logical ground for trusting their mind. They trust them, but they've no logical ground to do it. As a Christian, of course, believing that God created the universe out there and my mind in here, I have every ground for trusting and believing in God with my mind. Of course I have, because that atheist argument doesn't apply to me. Now, the next one was, were time, matter, and space created simultaneously? Well, I don't claim to be an expert in cosmology. I read all the books, and the idea of a simultaneous creation runs up against, well, as far as Hawking's concerned, against his no-boundary concepts of time at the beginning. And I find that a very stretching idea. But let me go back to the more simple place. And the fascinating thing for me as a Christian is the biblical record is that God did not create everything simultaneously. There's a sequence. Now, what you make of it or not is another matter, but there is a sequence. And God said, and God said, and God said, and God said. And it seems to me to be a very deliberate sequence to make some very provocative points, almost as if the writer of Genesis had thought about the contemporary era. Because on so-called day 3, and if you're interested in the days, I've just had a book translated into Norwegian on that topic. On day 3, there are two times that God speaks twice. And God said, and you get inorganic material. And then you get, and God said, and you get organic material. I find that fascinating because it's indicating, at least there, that you do not get from the inorganic to the organic by mindless, unguided processes. And it's the same on day 6 between animals and humans. As I say, that seems to me to almost anticipate a contemporary debate. So the idea that creation itself, broadly speaking, is not simultaneous is, it seems to me, thoroughly biblical. Okay, do you find students more or less receptive than 15 to 20 years ago? Well, you all look so young, you know, to me now. I've been living with students for well over 50 years, and in a way, their questions don't change much. When I was in Cambridge in the 1960s, they were very receptive. I mean, we had 10,000 students. We get 500 of them every Saturday night to have a public Bible study. That was incredible. If we had a special meeting, we'd get 1,000. So the interest in Christianity was huge, but only less than 10% of the population went to university. I am very encouraged in what I see around Europe as to interest among students, because look at the group that's here today. And by the way, thank you for coming. You've taken out time to come to this. But I find this in almost every university I visited over the last 20 or 30 years. People are getting a little bit tired of the emptiness of a materialistic philosophy. Often they haven't grown up with Christianity, so they haven't been put off by a negative experience of religion. And they may have come into contact among their fellow students with Christians who are really living the Christian life, and they've got some sort of life to offer. And therefore, it seems to me that there is perhaps more, although that's dangerous. It's always very dangerous to make generalizations. But let me put it this way. I keep doing it. And I keep doing it because of the immense response of people like yourselves. The exciting thing about a university like this is that you can learn from different perspectives. No doubt you've had Dawkins here in the past, but you can learn from different perspectives. And by learning from different perspectives, you can... Oh, I've lost the whole thing. Isn't that clever? I just wanted to show you the very last slide, which you don't need to see because I can say it. There it is. You got the chance to investigate and make up your own minds. Can I tell them a story? A little story. Why I do this kind of thing. When I was 19, I met my first Nobel Prize winner. And I sat beside him at dinner, and he tried... Well, I talked to him about my Christian faith, and he didn't like it. So being a kind Irishman, I backed off. And at the end of the dinner, he invited me to his room, and it sounded threatening. And he asked me to sit down, and he had 2 or 3 other professors with him, no students. He said, "Lennox, do you want to make a career in science?" "Yes, sir." "Well, in front of witnesses tonight, give up this naive and childish faith in God. It will destroy you. You'll never get anywhere in mathematics. You will suffer by comparison with your peers." Talk about terrifying. And I couldn't help thinking, if he'd been a Christian and I'd been an atheist, he'd have lost his job the next day. And I asked him what he had to offer me that was better than what I'd got already. And he came out with a theory of evolutionism that I happen to know about by Émile Bergson. And I said, if that's all you've got, I'll take a risk and stick with what I've got. But I tell you, the reason I sit in front of you is this. I resolved on that day at the age of 19 that if ever I got the chance to mention these things in public, I would not try to browbeat people. I'd try and present the evidence as I saw it and respect them enough to make up their own minds. There are a couple of other questions. Is it metaphysically possible there is no God? Well, I presume so, since you made a metaphysical statement to that effect. You see, in connection with what I've just said to you, I have spent my whole life making my faith in God publicly vulnerable. Why? Because I come from Ireland. And when I got to Cambridge, the Freudian objection was already there. You believe in God, poor chap. Of course you do. All the Irish do, and they fight about it. Well, you see, when you're brought up in that, I wanted to know. And so on my first day at Cambridge, I deliberately befriended a person who didn't share my worldview. And I've been doing it all of my life. So those kind of questions I've been treating with endlessly and had the opportunity to discuss it with some of the leading atheists in the world because I wanted to be sure. And the reason I sit here confident as a Christian is not because there's anything special about me, because what I've discovered is that when you expose a living faith in Christ to the world, and I've done it a lot in Russia, and they know what atheism is, far better than anybody in Western Europe, you find that it stands the test of time. So a lot of these quasi-metaphysical questions, in one sense, I answer them at the practical level because it's the only level. I don't count myself as an expert philosopher, although I love philosophy. It is so interesting. Is God necessary or not? Now, suppose you decide he is. What way is that going to change your life and your thinking? These are difficult and they're interesting questions. But in a way, I find it much more satisfying to expose what you believe in the public space. Do we need a God? Do we need to believe? Well, that, of course, is just Freudian emotionalism. You believe in God because you need one. Well, some people do believe in God because they need one. That doesn't prove he exists or not. You've got to decide that on different grounds. It would be very surprising if a God of love who sent Christ to die for me, if that didn't create some emotional response if it's true. Very surprising. So if it's true, you may expect it to fulfill a need. But because it initially seems to fulfill a need, that doesn't prove it's true. You've got to settle that afterwards. But we need to watch that kind of argument. Those pills fulfill a need, well, therefore they can't be right. Well, they may be right, you see. So that we need to distinguish the different kinds of evidence. Now, one of the questioners asked about souls and the afterlife. Well, this is a huge topic. If you want to know what I think about the soul, have a look at the mind-body problem. Have a look at an article I wrote for a book mistitled The Missing Link by Roy Varghese. It's where a whole crew of us, mostly scientists, answer the question, what's your personal take on the mind-body problem. But the afterlife seems to me to be one of the things utterly guaranteed for the Christian. Because I firmly believe, nobody asked me about the miracles, that's fine, you obviously understand all about them, that's good. Because I firmly believe, and it's the heart of my Christian foundation, that Jesus Christ actually did physically rise from the dead. So he's broken the death barrier. That's a huge thing. Because all of us, handling death is very problematic. And the older you get, the nearer you get to it, and you wonder about it. But I'm a person who's already been told he's going to die. I was within a few seconds of it medically. And I had total peace. Said goodbye to my wife. Didn't think I'd see her again. Now, I'm not telling you that as a dramatic story. I'm telling you that because it's exactly what I would expect to happen if Christianity is true. So that, talking about the afterlife, Christ gives those who trust him the confident expectation that physical death will not be the end. There is to be a resurrection. There is to be a new heavens and a new earth. But that's a huge story. So, let me finish with this. Our title was, Can We Believe in God in a Scientific World? Well, whatever a scientific world is, the world is more than scientific. That only describes part of the way we analyze it. You could say, can we believe in God in a historical world or in a literary world? And I would want to say we can believe in God in all these kinds of worlds because he created the world in the first place. And he's given ample evidence in that world and in ourselves that we can read. My big difficulty, I confess to you, is I would find it impossible to believe in atheism in a world in which science exists. See, I'm passionate about science. I don't want to have it on a shaky ground. Or at least I'd feel embarrassed to have it on a shaky ground. But many do. Yet, as I said, atheism raises doubts about the validity of the rational processes needed to do science. But I've said enough. You investigate it, make up your own minds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much again, John Lennox. It was a wonderful lecture. And with 7 questions, I guess that's enough. Those of you who have even more questions, there is actually an invitation for in RF-kjelleren, under here, I believe it is. The Christian Student Union has a free dinner for those who have even more questions. So, thank you.